On the morning of August 4th, 1892, something unspeakable happened inside a modest house at 92 2nd Street in Fall River, Massachusetts. Two people were butchered with a small axe in broad daylight, 19 savage blows to one victim, 11 to the other. The killer moved through the house undetected for over an hour, waiting, watching, planning. Despite a national manhunt and one of the most sensational trials in American history, the murderer was never truly identified. What the authorities discovered in that sweltering August heat would challenge everything they thought they knew about human nature, family loyalty, and the dark secrets that fester behind closed doors in respectable New England homes. Before we continue with the story of the Hennessy family and their Irish maid who witnessed everything, make sure to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We want to know where our fellow mystery lovers are gathered tonight. But first, let me take you back to a time when Fall River was still bleeding from the wounds of industrialization, when immigrant families served in the shadows of Yankee wealth, and when a single morning would shatter the illusion of safety that an entire community had built around itself. Fall River, Massachusetts, in the summer of 1892, was a city caught between two worlds. The old Yankee families who had built their fortunes on whaling and maritime trade now watched nervously as smoke-belching textile mills transformed their genteel community into something harder, more desperate. The Spindle City, they called it, a place where French, Canadian, and Irish immigrants worked 16-hour shifts in suffocating factories, their children's futures measured in lint and lost fingers. The Hennessy house stood on 2nd Street like a monument to old money's stubborn resistance to change. Andrew Hennessy had made his fortune the traditional way, first in coffins, an irony that would later haunt every newspaper account of what happened there. By 1892, he owned rental properties, held directorships in mills, and commanded respect through fear rather than affection. At 70, his angular frame and penetrating gray eyes made grown men stammer when they came to pay their rent. His wife Abby was his second marriage, a practical arrangement that had lasted 27 years without ever warming into genuine affection. She was a broad-shouldered woman of 64, with graying hair always pulled tight enough to stretch the lines from her temples. The Irish girl who cleaned their house called her ma'am, with the careful deference of someone who understood exactly where she stood in the world. That girl, Bridget O'Malley, had arrived from County Cork 3 years earlier, with nothing but a cardboard suitcase and a recommendation letter from a priest. At 25, she moved through the Hennessy house like a ghost, speaking only when spoken to, her rough hands maintaining the spotless surfaces that testified to proper Yankee breeding. She had learned to navigate the peculiar tensions that existed between Mr. Hennessy and his daughters from his first marriage. Lizzie Hennessy, 32 and unmarried, possessed the kind of restless intelligence that made other women uncomfortable. She read voraciously, spoke her mind at church meetings, and had opinions about women's suffrage that her father found inappropriate. Her older sister Emma, 41 and equally spinsterish by the standards of the day, had long ago retreated into a shell of resignation and bitter compliance. The sisters had never accepted Abby as their mother, addressing her only as Mrs. Hennessy, even after nearly 3 decades. This wasn't mere rudeness. It was a calculated campaign of exclusion that had gradually poisoned the atmosphere of the house. Bridget had witnessed conversations that stopped abruptly when Abby entered a room, seen Emma and Lizzie exchange glances heavy with meaning, felt the weight of secrets that pressed against the walls like humidity before a storm. The summer of 1892 had been particularly oppressive. The mill workers were restless. There had been strikes in Lawrence and Lowell, whispers of labor organizers moving through the tenements. The Hennessy family felt the pressure from multiple directions. Financial uncertainty as textile markets fluctuated, social tension as old Fall River families found themselves outnumbered by immigrants, and the constant friction within their own walls. In the weeks leading up to August 4th, that friction had escalated into something more dangerous. Family arguments had become more frequent and more vicious. Lizzie had been heard shouting at her father about money, about his will, about property that she believed should rightfully belong to her and Emma. Neighbors later recalled seeing lights burning late into the night, voices raised in the kind of anger that carries through thin walls and closed windows. Bridget tried to stay invisible during these confrontations, but in a house that size, privacy was an illusion. She knew that Mr. Hennessy had recently changed his will, knew that he had been discussing property transfers that would leave his daughters with less than they expected. She knew about the poisonous resentment that Emma harbored toward Abby, about Lizzie's increasingly erratic behavior, about conversations that ceased abruptly when she entered rooms to dust or sweep. What she didn't know was how close they all were to a breaking point that would transform their private grievances into a public horror. The morning of August 4th dawned thick and sultry, the kind of heat that made clothing stick to skin and tempers flare without warning. Bridget was up before dawn, as always, stoking the kitchen fire and preparing breakfast for a family that rarely ate together anymore. The tension in the house had become so thick you could taste it, metallic and bitter like blood in your mouth. John Desmond, Mrs. Hennessy's brother-in-law from out of town, had arrived unexpectedly the night before. A gaunt man with nervous hands and restless eyes, he claimed to be in Fall River on business, but Bridget had overheard enough whispered conversations to know his visit had something to do with property deals and family money. His presence added another layer of stress to an already volatile situation. At breakfast, the family gathered in the dining room for what would be their last meal together. Mr. Hennessy sat at the head of the table, reading his newspaper with the deliberate silence of a man asserting his authority. Abby served weak coffee and day-old bread, her movements careful and subdued. Desmond picked at his food nervously, occasionally glancing toward the stairs where Lizzie remained in her room. "She's been acting strange lately," Abby confided to her brother-in-law in a voice that carried just far enough for Bridget to hear from the kitchen, asking questions about money, about the will. "Yesterday I caught her going through Andrew's papers in his study." Desmond nodded grimly. "Property disputes can tear a family apart. I've seen it happen before." When Lizzie finally appeared, her pale face was flushed with an emotion that Bridget couldn't quite identify. Anger, certainly, but something else as well. Something that made the Irish girl's hands tremble as she cleared the breakfast dishes. Lizzie's dark eyes swept the room with the intensity of someone cataloging everything she saw, memorizing details for future use. The family conversation was stilted, formal, loaded with undercurrents that Bridget only partially understood. There was talk of property on the south side, of rental income, of decisions that needed to be made. Mr. Hennessy's voice carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, while Abby nodded agreement to everything he said. Lizzie said nothing, but her silence was more ominous than any argument. Around 9 o'clock, Desmond announced his intention to visit relatives across town. He would return that evening, he said, to conclude his business with Mr. Hennessy. As he gathered his coat and hat, Bridget noticed how his hands shook, how his eyes avoided direct contact with Lizzie's intense stare. 20 minutes later, Mr. Hennessy left for his morning rounds, collecting rents, checking on properties, conducting the business that kept his family in their comfortable isolation from the struggles of working-class Fall River. He kissed Abby's cheek with perfunctory affection and reminded Bridget to wash the outside windows, a task that would keep her busy for most of the morning. That left 3 women alone in the house, Abby, Lizzie, and Bridget. One of them would be dead within the hour. Bridget was struggling with the heavy windows on the east side of the house when she heard the first scream. It was brief, cut off abruptly but unmistakably human. She paused, brushed dripping soapy water onto the porch and listened. Nothing. The street was quiet except for the distant clatter of a milk wagon and the normal sounds of a residential neighborhood going about its morning business. She resumed washing, but her movements were less confident now. There was something in the quality of that scream, not surprise or annoyance but genuine terror, that made her stomach clench with primitive fear. When the second scream came, longer and more desperate, Bridget dropped her brush entirely. It was coming from inside the house, from upstairs, from the direction of the guest room where Abby had been making beds and tidying up after Desmond's visit. The screaming stopped again, but this time the silence was worse than the sound had been. Bridget's Protestant upbringing had taught her that curiosity was a sin, but 3 years in the Hennessy household had also taught her that ignoring potential disasters could cost her job. She wiped her hands on her apron and approached the back door, listening carefully. Nothing. She climbed the back stairs slowly, her footsteps muffled by the carpet runner that Mrs. Hennessy had installed to keep the house quiet during Mr. Hennessy's afternoon naps. The hallway at the top of the stairs was dimly lit, shadowy in the morning light that filtered through lace curtains. The guest room door was slightly ajar. Bridget called out softly, "Mrs. Hennessy, Ma'am, are you all right?" No answer. She pushed the door open wider and stepped into a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Abby Hennessy lay face down on the floor beside the bed, her grey dress dark with blood. Her head was a ruin of bone and brain matter, crushed beyond recognition by repeated blows from something heavy and sharp. Blood had sprayed across the floral wallpaper in patterns that looked almost decorative if you didn't know what they were. But it was the smell that made Bridget's knees buckle. Metallic, sweet, overwhelmingly organic. The smell of a slaughterhouse, of humanity reduced to meat. And standing in the corner of the room, still holding the small axe that had done the work, was Lizzie Hennessy. Her white shirtwaist was pristine, unstained. Her dark hair was perfectly arranged, but her eyes held an expression that Bridget would later struggle to describe to investigators, not madness exactly, but a kind of cold satisfaction, as if she had just completed a necessary but unpleasant task. "She fell," Lizzie said calmly, as if she were commenting on the weather. "Poor dear. She must have slipped." Bridget looked at the axe in Lizzie's hands, at the devastation on the floor, at the blood on the walls. She opened her mouth to scream, to run, to do something, but Lizzie's voice stopped her. "You're going to help me, Bridget, because if you don't, they'll say you did this. An Irish girl with no family, no connections, no one to speak for her. Who do you think they'll believe?" The words hit Bridget like physical blows. She was 25 years old. 3,000 miles from home, alone in a country that viewed Irish immigrants as inherently criminal and morally suspect. She had seen what happened to Irish girls who crossed their employers. They disappeared into police cells or poverty or worse, and no one asked questions. "What do you want me to do?" she whispered. Lizzie smiled, and in that smile Bridget glimpsed something that was far more terrifying than anger or madness. This was calculation. Pure and simple. This was a woman who had planned not just murder, but its aftermath. "We wait," Lizzie said. "Father will be home soon, and then this will all be over." The next hour passed with the surreal quality of a fever dream. Lizzie cleaned the axe methodically in the wash basin, her movements as precise as a surgeon's. She changed her dress, bundling the blood-stained clothing into a laundry bag that she hid in the cellar. She repositioned Abby's body to make the wounds less obvious from the doorway, then closed the guest room door and locked it. Bridget watched all of this in numbed silence, paralyzed by the recognition that she was now complicit in whatever was happening. Every moment she remained silent made her more guilty, more trapped, more dependent on Lizzie's version of events. "You must understand," Lizzie said as she washed her hands with the thoroughness of Lady Macbeth, "that I had no choice. She was going to destroy everything, take Father's money, leave Emma and me with nothing. She was poison in this house, Bridget. You've seen how she manipulated him, how she turned him against his own blood." The justification rolled off Lizzie's tongue with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed it many times. But Bridget noticed how Lizzie's hands continued to shake even after they were clean, how her eyes darted constantly toward the locked guest room door. At 11 o'clock, they heard Mr. Hennessy's key in the front door. "Remember," Lizzie whispered, her fingers digging into Bridget's arm with surprising strength. "She went out to visit a sick friend. She received a note this morning. You saw the messenger bring it." Bridget nodded, though she had seen no messenger, no note. The lie felt heavy on her tongue, but the alternative, being charged with murder in a system that had already decided Irish girls were guilty of something, felt heavier. Mr. Hennessy entered the house in his usual manner, calling for Abby to help him with his coat. When he received no answer, he settled into his favorite chair in the sitting room, still wearing his boots and summer jacket. At 70, the morning's heat had exhausted him more than usual. "Where's Mrs. Hennessy?" he asked Lizzie, who had appeared in the doorway with an expression of mild concern. "She received a note about Mrs. Churchill being ill," Lizzie replied smoothly. "She left about an hour ago, said she might not be back until this evening." Mr. Hennessy grunted his acceptance and closed his eyes. Within minutes, the regular rise and fall of his chest indicated that he had fallen into the deep sleep of an elderly man on a hot day. Lizzie watched him for several long minutes, her face expressionless. Then she turned to Bridget and nodded toward the kitchen. "I'm going upstairs to rest," she announced, loudly enough for her father to hear if he was still conscious. "The heat is making me feel faint." But instead of going to her room, Lizzie retrieved the axe from where she had hidden it behind the cellar door. Bridget wanted to run, to scream, to do something to stop what was about to happen. But her feet felt rooted to the kitchen floor, and her voice had abandoned her entirely. She could only watch as Lizzie walked quietly back toward the sitting room, the axe hidden in the folds of her clean dress. The first blow caught Mr. Hennessy just above the left temple as he slept. His eyes snapped open in surprise and pain, but there was no time for him to understand what was happening. The second blow split his forehead down to the eye socket. The third, fourth, fifth, and sixth obliterated the left side of his face entirely. By the time Lizzie was finished, Andrew Hennessy's head was a crater of bone and blood, and his daughter was standing over him with the same cold satisfaction she had displayed upstairs. But this time, she was breathing hard. "Now we scream," she told Bridget. "We discover the body. We call for help. And we never speak of what really happened here." The performance that followed was masterful. Lizzie's screams brought neighbors running from 3 houses away. Her sobbing collapse in the front yard convinced everyone that she was as much a victim as the dead man in the sitting room. Even Dr. Henshaw, who had known the family for 20 years, was moved by her apparent grief. But Bridget noticed things that the others missed. She saw how Lizzie's tears never quite reached her eyes. She noticed how quickly Lizzie recovered her composure when she thought no one was watching. Most disturbing of all, she observed how Lizzie seemed to anticipate the questions that the police would ask, as if she had prepared for this interrogation. When investigators discovered Abby's body upstairs, Lizzie's shock seemed genuine enough to fool everyone except the Irish girl who had witnessed the truth. The official narrative began to form immediately. An unknown intruder had somehow entered the house, committed 2 brutal murders, and escaped without being seen by anyone in the neighborhood. It was a convenient story. It allowed Fall River's respectable citizens to sleep soundly, secure in the knowledge that evil was something that came from outside their community, not something that festered within their own families. But Bridget knew better. And as the days passed and the investigation intensified, she began to understand that her knowledge made her dangerous to more people than just Lizzie Hennessy. The investigation that followed the murders revealed a Fall River that most residents preferred to ignore, a city where Yankee respectability was a thin veneer over simmering resentments, where family loyalty was a luxury that few could afford, and where the truth was often the most dangerous thing of all. Detective Mallory, brought in from Boston to lead the investigation, was a methodical man who understood that domestic murders were rarely as mysterious as they first appeared. Within 48 hours, he had identified several troubling aspects of the case that suggested the killer was intimately familiar with the Hennessy household. The lack of forced entry was the first red flag. The Hennessys were obsessive about security, keeping their doors locked even during daylight hours. Yet there were no signs that anyone had broken in, no indication that the killer had needed to search for victims or weapons. The timing of the murders was equally suspicious. Abby had been killed approximately 90 minutes before her husband, yet no one in the neighborhood had seen a stranger entering or leaving the house. For an outsider to commit both murders, he would have had to hide somewhere in the house for over an hour, a nearly impossible feat in a building where every room was in constant use. Most damning of all was the nature of the weapon. The axe belonged to the Hennessy family, kept in the cellar for splitting kindling. An intruder would have had to be extraordinarily familiar with the house's layout to locate it so quickly and quietly. But Detective Mallory's investigation faced obstacles that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with social class. Fall River's establishment was deeply uncomfortable with the possibility that one of their own might be capable of such violence. The Hennessys were pillars of the community, wealthy, Protestant, respectable. To suggest that Lizzie might have murdered her parents was to question the fundamental assumptions upon which the city's social order was built. The pressure to find an external culprit was enormous. Police arrested several Portuguese immigrants on flimsy pretexts, held Irish laborers for questioning without cause, and pursued leads that anyone with common sense could see were fabricated. The newspapers, meanwhile, painted the murders as evidence of the growing threat posed by foreign elements in American society. Bridget found herself caught in the middle of this investigation, her testimony crucial, but her credibility constantly questioned. As an Irish domestic servant, she occupied the lowest rung of Fall River's social hierarchy. Her account of events was treated with suspicion, not because it was inconsistent, but because it came from someone whose word was considered inherently unreliable. During her initial interviews, Bridget stuck to the story that Lizzie had concocted. Mrs. Hennessy had left to visit a sick friend. Mr. Hennessy had come home for a nap, and both women had been in different parts of the house when the murders occurred. She described hearing strange noises, finding the bodies and summoning help. But Detective Mallory was experienced enough to recognize when witnesses were holding back information. He noticed the way Bridget's hands trembled when she described finding Abby's body, how her voice dropped to a whisper when discussing Lizzie's whereabouts, how she seemed to be reciting rehearsed answers rather than recalling actual events. "There's something you're not telling me," he said during their third interview, his voice gentle but insistent. "I understand you're frightened, but if you know something that might help us catch the person who did this, you have a moral obligation to speak." Bridget met his eyes for a moment, and Detective Mallory saw something there that chilled him. Not fear, exactly, but the kind of hopeless resignation that came from understanding that the truth might be more dangerous than any lie. "I've told you everything I know," she said quietly. "I wish I could help more, but I was outside washing windows when it happened. I didn't see anything." The detective didn't believe her, but he also understood that he couldn't force her to reveal what she was hiding. In 1892, Massachusetts, the rights of domestic servants were minimal, especially if they were immigrants. Bridget O'Malley could be fired, blacklisted, or even deported if she made the wrong enemies. As the investigation dragged on through August and into September, the focus gradually shifted toward Lizzie herself. Her behavior in the days following the murders had struck many observers as odd, too controlled, too calculating for someone who had just lost both parents to a brutal attack. There were other troubling details. Several druggists in Fall River came forward to report that a woman matching Lizzie's description had attempted to purchase prussic acid, a deadly poison, on August 3rd, the day before the murders. The woman had claimed she needed it to clean a sealskin cape, but prussic acid had no legitimate use in garment care. More damaging still was the testimony of Alice Thornton, a family friend who had been staying with the Hennessys in the days after the murders. Mrs. Thornton reported that she had seen Lizzie burning a dress in the kitchen stove on August 7th, just 3 days after the killings. When questioned, Lizzie claimed the dress had been stained with paint and was no longer wearable. But investigators who examined the stove found no evidence of paint, and the timing of the dress burning struck them as highly suspicious. In a crime where the killer would have been covered with blood, the destruction of potentially stained clothing looked less like housekeeping and more like evidence tampering. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. John Desmond, the brother-in-law who had been visiting the Hennessy house on the morning of the murders. Desmond had initially provided Lizzie with an alibi, claiming that he had left the house early and seen nothing suspicious. But as public scrutiny intensified, Desmond became increasingly nervous about his involvement in events he didn't fully understand. During a follow-up interview in late August, he revealed a conversation he had overheard the night before the murders, a heated argument between Lizzie and her father about money and property rights. "She was angrier than I'd ever seen her," Desmond told Detective Mallory. "She said something about not letting Abby steal what belonged to her and Emma. Said she'd see them all dead before she'd let that happen." The statement was damning but still circumstantial. What Detective Mallory needed was direct evidence linking Lizzie to the murders, or a witness willing to testify about what had really happened in the Hennessy house that morning. He was beginning to suspect that he already had such a witness. The question was whether Bridget O'Malley would find the courage to tell the truth before it was too late. By early September, the investigation had reached a critical juncture. Detective Mallory had assembled enough circumstantial evidence to arrest Lizzie Hennessy, but he knew that circumstantial cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute, especially when the defendant was a wealthy white woman with connections throughout the community. What he needed was either physical evidence definitively linking Lizzie to the murders, or testimony from someone who had witnessed the crime. Since the physical evidence had been compromised by the family's cleanup efforts and the initial bungling of the crime scene that left only one realistic option: convincing Bridget O'Malley to break her silence. The pressure on Bridget had been mounting steadily since the murders. She continued to work for the Hennessy family, now consisting only of Lizzie and Emma, but the atmosphere in the house had become suffocating. Lizzie watched her constantly, monitoring her conversations with investigators, controlling her access to information about the case. More disturbing were the subtle threats that peppered Lizzie's everyday conversation. References to what happened to Irish girls who betrayed their employers. Observations about how easy it was for immigrants to simply disappear if they caused trouble. Reminders that Bridget's word would never be believed against that of a respectable Yankee family. "You understand your position here, don't you?" Lizzie said one evening as Bridget prepared dinner. "You're part of this family now. What affects us affects you. If our reputation is damaged, you'll suffer the consequences." The message was clear. Bridget's survival depended on maintaining the fiction that they had constructed together. But Detective Mallory was equally persistent. He made a point of interviewing Bridget regularly, always with different questions, always probing for inconsistencies in her story. He was a patient man who understood that frightened witnesses sometimes needed multiple opportunities to find their courage. During one such interview in mid-September, he tried a different approach. "I've been thinking about your situation," he said, settling back in his chair with the casual air of someone making conversation. "You're young, intelligent, hard-working. You could have a good life in America if you wanted it. But you're never going to have that life if you're connected to this family." Bridget kept her eyes on her hands, folded carefully in her lap. "I don't know what you mean, sir. I think you do. I think you know exactly what happened in that house, and I think you know that keeping silent about it is going to destroy you. Maybe not today, maybe not next month, but eventually." He leaned forward, his voice taking on a more urgent tone. "Lizzie Hennessy killed her parents, didn't she? And you saw her do it." For a moment, Bridget's carefully constructed facade cracked. Detective Mallory saw the flash of truth in her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands, the way her breathing quickened. But then the mask slammed back into place. "No, sir," she said firmly. "I told you what happened. I was outside washing windows. I didn't see anything until I found the bodies." Detective Mallory studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. But if you change your mind, if you decide you want to tell me the truth, you know where to find me. And Bridget, when this comes to trial, and it will come to trial, you're going to be the key witness. The prosecution and the defense are both going to want your testimony. Think carefully about which version of events you want to be remembered for." That night, Bridget lay awake in her small room under the eaves, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around her. 2 floors below, in the sitting room where Mr. Hennessy had died, the bloodstains had been scrubbed away and new furniture brought in. But she could still smell it sometimes, that metallic sweetness that had saturated the air that morning. She thought about Detective Mallory's words, about the life she might have if she found the courage to speak the truth. But she also thought about what would happen to her if she accused Lizzie and the jury didn't believe her. Irish girls who accused their betters of serious crimes had a way of ending up in institutions or worse. The decision was made for her 3 days later. Bridget was dusting the front parlor when she heard voices from Lizzie's room upstairs. Lizzie and her sister Emma, speaking in the urgent whispers that meant family business. She shouldn't have listened, should have continued with her work and pretended not to hear. But something in their tone made her pause. "The detective is getting too close," Emma was saying. "He's been asking questions about the will, about father's business dealings. And that Irish girl is weak. I can see it in her eyes." "Bridget won't talk," Lizzie replied confidently. "She's too frightened. And even if she did, who would believe her? The word of an Irish domestic against ours. But what if they do believe her? What if she tells them what really happened?" There was a long pause, and when Lizzie spoke again, her voice carried a chill that made Bridget's blood freeze. "Then we'll have to make sure she can't tell anyone anything." The conversation continued, but Bridget had heard enough. She finished her dusting with trembling hands, her mind racing through possibilities and contingencies. That evening, she made a decision that would change the course of the investigation. She went to Detective Mallory's boarding house and asked to speak with him privately. "I need to tell you something," she said, her Irish accent thicker than usual in her nervousness, "about what really happened that morning, about what I really saw." Detective Mallory poured her a cup of tea and settled in to listen. What Bridget told him over the next 2 hours would form the foundation of the prosecution's case against Lizzie Hennessy, and would ultimately determine whether justice would be served or whether a calculating killer would walk free. But as Bridget spoke, unburdening herself of the secret that had been eating away at her conscience for months, neither she nor Detective Mallory realized that Lizzie Hennessy was far more resourceful and ruthless than either of them had imagined. The game was far from over. The trial of Lizzie Hennessy for the murders of her father and stepmother began on June 5, 1893, in New Bedford, Massachusetts. The case had become a national sensation, with newspapers from Boston to San Francisco covering every detail of the proceedings. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators, reporters, and curiosity seekers who had come to witness what many considered the trial of the century. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Harrison Knowlton, built their case methodically around the testimony of Bridget O'Malley and the circumstantial evidence that Detective Mallory had assembled. They painted a picture of a calculating woman who had murdered her parents for financial gain, using her intimate knowledge of the house and family routine to commit the perfect crime. Bridget's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Speaking in a clear, steady voice despite the hostile stares from the defense table, she described in horrific detail what she had witnessed on the morning of August 4th, 1892. "I saw Miss Lizzie standing over Mrs. Hennessy's body," she told the hushed courtroom. "She was holding the axe, and there was blood everywhere. When she saw me, she said that Mrs. Hennessy had fallen, but I could see what had really happened." The defense attorney, George Robinson, a former governor of Massachusetts and one of the most skilled criminal lawyers in New England, attacked Bridget's credibility relentlessly. He emphasized her status as an Irish immigrant, suggested that her testimony was motivated by jealousy and class resentment, and pointed out the inconsistencies between her trial testimony and her initial statements to police. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Robinson declared in his opening statement, "the prosecution would have you convict a respectable American woman on the word of a foreign domestic who has already admitted to lying to investigators. This is not justice, this is scapegoating of the worst kind." But the prosecution had more than just Bridget's testimony. They presented evidence about Lizzie's attempt to purchase poison the day before the murders. her suspicious behavior after the killings, and the burned dress that could have contained bloodstains. They called financial experts who testified about the inheritance motive, medical experts who described the savage nature of the attacks, and character witnesses who painted a picture of a dysfunctional family torn apart by greed and resentment. The defense strategy was masterful in its simplicity. They argued that a respectable woman like Lizzie Hennessy was simply incapable of such brutality. Victorian gender stereotypes worked in their favor. The idea that a well-bred lady could wield an axe with enough force to shatter skulls was almost unthinkable to the all-male jury. Robinson also skillfully exploited the anti-Irish prejudices of the era. He suggested that Bridget herself might have committed the murders, pointing out that she had been alone in the house with both victims and had access to the murder weapon. He painted her as a typical Irish servant, dishonest, violent, and motivated by class hatred. Consider the source of this testimony, he urged the jury. An immigrant girl with no family, no education, no moral foundation. A girl who admits she lied to police, who changed her story when it became convenient, who now seeks to destroy an innocent woman to save herself from suspicion. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with testimony from over 100 witnesses. The evidence presented painted a complex picture of family dysfunction, financial disputes, and simmering resentments that had finally exploded into violence. But the most dramatic moment came when Lizzie herself took the stand in her own defense. Against her lawyer's advice, she insisted on testifying, confident in her ability to convince the jury of her innocence. Lizzie's performance was masterful. She spoke softly, forcing the courtroom to strain to hear her words. She wept when describing her love for her parents, her voice breaking as she recounted finding her father's body. She maintained her innocence with such conviction that even some reporters found themselves questioning whether she could really be guilty. Under cross-examination, however, cracks began to appear in Lizzie's facade. District Attorney Knowlton was relentless in his questioning, forcing her to explain the contradictions in her story, the suspicious timing of her actions, and her knowledge of details that only the killer could have known. "Miss Hennessy," Knowlton said, his voice sharp with prosecutorial precision, "you testified that you were in the barn when your father was murdered. Yet 3 witnesses have stated that they searched the barn immediately after the body was discovered and found no evidence that anyone had been there recently. How do you explain this discrepancy?" For the first time during her testimony, Lizzie hesitated. The confident mask slipped just enough for the jury to glimpse something calculating underneath. I may have been mistaken about the exact time," she said. "The shock of discovering father's body. It's difficult to remember every detail clearly. Indeed, memory can be unreliable under stress. Tell me, Miss Hennessy, do you remember attempting to purchase prussic acid from Smith's drugstore on August 3rd? "No, I do not." "You don't remember, or it didn't happen?" "It didn't happen." Knowlton approached the witness stand, holding a piece of paper. "I have here a signed statement from Eli Bentz, the clerk at Smith's drugstore. He identifies you positively as the woman who attempted to purchase 10 cents worth of prussic acid on the afternoon of August 3rd. He says you became angry when he refused the sale. Are you calling Mr. Bentz a liar?" Lizzie's composure finally cracked completely. Her face flushed red, and her voice rose to an almost hysterical pitch. "How dare you question my character? I am a Christian woman, a member of this community. I could never." She stopped herself, but the damage was done. The jury had seen behind the mask, and what they found there was not the grieving daughter she had portrayed, but something much darker. The moment that sealed Lizzie's fate came when Knowlton produced the most damning piece of evidence the prosecution had uncovered. A letter that Bridget had written to her sister in Ireland 3 weeks after the murders. The letter had been intercepted by postal inspectors and held as potential evidence. "Miss O'Malley wrote this letter on August 25th, 1892, Knowlton announced. "With the court's permission, I'd like to read a portion of it aloud." The letter, written in Bridget's careful handwriting, contained details that she had never shared with investigators. Details that could only have come from someone who had witnessed the murders firsthand. "Dear Mary," Knowlton read, "I cannot sleep at night for the terrible thing I have seen. Miss Lizzie has told me I must never speak of it, but I fear for my soul if I do not tell someone the truth. She killed them both, Mary. I saw her do it with my own eyes. She killed the old woman first, then waited for the master to come home. When it was over, she looked at me with such cold eyes and said I would hang for it if I ever told. But I cannot live with this secret much longer." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Lizzie's supporters shouted protest while her detractors called for immediate conviction. Judge Dewey had to threaten to clear the courtroom before order was restored. But even more devastating than the letter itself was what happened next. Defense attorney Robinson, realizing that his client's case was collapsing, made a desperate gambit. He called for a brief recess and then requested a private conference with Lizzie and her sister Emma. What was said in that conference room was never officially recorded, but court stenographer Margaret Kellerman would later claim that she overheard fragments of a heated conversation through the thin walls. According to Kellerman, Emma Hennessy finally broke under the pressure and admitted to her sister's lawyer that she had suspected Lizzie's guilt from the beginning. "She's always been capable of violence when she doesn't get her way," Emma allegedly said. "Even as a child, she would hurt animals when she was angry. I tried to protect her, tried to give her alibis, but I can't watch her destroy that poor Irish girl to save herself." When the trial resumed, the defense's strategy had completely changed. Robinson no longer argued for Lizzie's innocence. Instead, he attempted to argue for diminished capacity, suggesting that his client had been suffering from a form of temporary insanity brought on by years of emotional abuse. It was too little, too late. On June 20th, 1893, after deliberating for just over 2 hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on 2 counts of murder in the first degree. But even as the verdict was read, Lizzie maintained her innocence with a conviction that was almost supernatural in its intensity. As the bailiffs approached to take her into custody, she turned to face the packed courtroom and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. "I am innocent of these charges," she declared, "and someday, when the truth is finally known, you will all understand the terrible mistake you have made here today." Some of those present would later claim that there was something prophetic in her words, something that suggested she knew secrets that had not been revealed in court. Others simply saw the final performance of a calculating killer who had been caught at last. The truth, as it often does, lay somewhere in between. Lizzie Hennessy was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Massachusetts State Prison for Women in Sherborne. The sentence was considered merciful. Many had expected her to receive the death penalty for such a brutal crime, but the jury had been influenced by the gender prejudices of the era. The idea of executing a woman, even one guilty of patricide, struck them as somehow barbaric. The trial's aftermath revealed the true cost of the investigation and prosecution. Bridget O'Malley, despite her crucial testimony, found herself effectively unemployable in Fall River. The Irish community viewed her as a traitor who had betrayed her employer, while the Yankee establishment saw her as an outsider who had brought scandal to their city. Within 6 months of the trial's conclusion, she had left Massachusetts entirely, moving west to Montana, where she hoped to start a new life far from the shadows of the Hennessy murders. Emma Hennessy suffered a complete nervous breakdown and was committed to a private sanitarium, where she would spend the remaining years of her life. The family fortune, such as it was tied up in legal proceedings for decades as various relatives and creditors fought over the estate. Detective Mallory, despite solving one of the most sensational cases of his career, found that the investigation had taken a toll on his health and his faith in human nature. He retired from police work within a year and moved to a small town in Vermont, where he spent his remaining years as a hardware store owner, rarely speaking of the case that had made his reputation. The Hennessy house at 92 2nd Street stood empty for several years after the murders. Local children claimed it was haunted, and indeed, there were reports of strange sounds, unexplained lights, and other phenomena that kept potential buyers away. When it was finally sold in 1898, the new owners had it completely renovated, tearing out walls and floors that might have contained bloodstains, painting over any evidence of the violence that had occurred there. But some stains run deeper than paint can cover. In 1918, 25 years after the trial, a remarkable document surfaced that cast new light on the Hennessy murders. A trunk found in the estate of Emma Hennessy's physician contained her private journal, written during her final years in the sanitarium. The journal entries, verified by handwriting experts, contained a detailed confession that contradicted much of what had been established at trial. According to Emma's journal, she and Lizzie had planned their parents' murders together over a period of several months. The motive was not simply financial, it was also deeply personal. Emma claimed that their father had been sexually abusing Lizzie for years, and that their stepmother had not only known about it, but had actively covered it up to protect her position in the family. "We had no choice," Emma wrote in an entry dated March 15, 1917. "The law would not have protected us, society would not have believed us. We were trapped in that house with monsters, and the only way to escape was to become monsters ourselves." The journal also revealed that the sisters had originally planned to poison their parents, which explained Lizzie's attempt to purchase prussic acid. When that plan failed, they had fallen back on the more primitive but reliable method of using the family axe. Most shocking of all was Emma's claim that Bridget O'Malley had not witnessed the murders at all. She had arrived on the scene after both parents were dead and had been coerced into lying about what she had seen. According to Emma, the Irish girl had been terrified into compliance by threats against her family back in Ireland. "Poor Bridget," Emma wrote. "We destroyed her life to save our own. She was innocent of everything except being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I pray that someday she will forgive us for what we made her do." The revelation of Emma's journal created a sensation in 1918, but by then most of the principal figures in the case were dead. Lizzie had died in prison in 1910, still maintaining her innocence. Bridget O'Malley had married and taken her husband's name, disappearing into the anonymity of the American West. Detective Mallory had passed away in 1915, taking his suspicions about the case to his grave. The journal raised more questions than it answered. If Emma's account was true, then the trial had resulted in a just verdict reached through false testimony. If it was false, the ramblings of a mentally ill woman trying to make sense of a senseless tragedy, then an innocent woman had been executed for crimes she didn't commit. The truth about what happened in the Hennessy house on August 4, 1892, died with the last of the participants. But the case left an indelible mark on American legal history, raising fundamental questions about domestic violence, women's rights, and the reliability of witness testimony that resonate to this day. In 1975, a reporter visiting Fall River discovered that Bridget O'Malley had indeed survived to old age, living under an assumed name in a small Montana town. She had married, raised children, and lived what appeared to be a normal life. But according to neighbors, she never spoke about her past, and she would become visibly distressed whenever anyone mentioned Fall River or the year 1892. Bridget died in 1948, taking her secrets to the grave. Her death certificate listed her cause of death as natural causes, but her pastor noted in his diary that her final words were, "I never told a single untruth at that trial. God help me, but I never told a single untruth." Whether that statement was a confession or a denial, no one could say for certain. The Hennessy murders remain officially solved, the case closed in the files of the Fall River Police Department. But for those who study the evidence carefully, who examine the contradictions and inconsistencies that peppered the investigation, one question remains unanswered. In a case where everyone involved had reason to lie, where social prejudices distorted the pursuit of justice, and where the truth was considered less important than maintaining the illusion of social order, how can we ever know what really happened in that sweltering house on an August morning more than a century ago? The answer, perhaps, is that we can't. And maybe that's exactly what someone wanted all along. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Fall River intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what secrets still lie buried in the shadows of American history. This mystery shows us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones that live within our own families, hiding behind masks of respectability and social standing. The Hennessy murders remind us that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flourishes. Sometimes it comes wearing the face of someone we trust, someone we love, someone we would never suspect. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Lizzie was guilty? Or was she a victim of circumstances and prejudice? Do you think Bridget O'Malley told the truth? Or was she coerced into a lie that destroyed multiple lives? Leave your comment below and let us know your theory. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries as much as you do. The shadows of the past are long, and sometimes they reach into the present in ways we never expect. Until next time, sleep well, if you can.